it's China's balance sheet is very healthy. We don't have any foreign debt. We got a lot of capital. I mean, there are so many tools in the economic toolbox. I mean, every economist, I go to them and say, why aren't they using these tools? They got all these tools. They got more tools than the Americans. But I finally figured it out. If they want the economy to fly next week, it will fly next week. But the economy that flies up is not the economy they want. They want a different economy. So we're like a patient in bed. They're giving the patient just enough oxygen so he stays alive.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming on a busy, today's Wednesday, right? It must be very challenging and costly for you to put down all your meetings and businesses and come to listen to the conversations and dialogues these 5 distinguished speakers are going to have. My job is very easy. It's just to keep the time to make sure that we can all finish by 5 o'clock. Otherwise, I'm sure they can keep talking for another 5 days. So the panelists need really no introduction. Some of you have heard of them speak. Some of you may have watched some of the YouTube videos. But as a moderator, I should still do the basic and the formal thing, which is to very, very briefly introduce them. And this will be my last time to call their last name. I want to save time and just call their first name from now on. So to my right is Professor Anthony Sage, who is the director of Raja Wali Foundation Institute for Asia, and Dao Wu, Professor of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. To his right is Eric Lee, who is the founding chairman of Chang Wei Capital, a private equity firm. But he has many other distinguished titles, including being on the advisory board for multiple universities like Stanford University Business School. But he's most well known for his very highly provocative and viewed YouTube videos in both Chinese and English. And I'm going to let him speak to you directly about what he thinks about China today. To his right-hand side is Karen Dinan, who is the professor of practice of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. More importantly, or I should say equally importantly, former assistant secretary for economic policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury. And then sitting to her right-hand side is Professor Edward Cunningham, who is the director of Ash Center China Programs and of the Asia Energy and Sustainability Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School. Last but not least, hi, Brian, far away from me, who is the youngest, probably not just on the panel, but in the whole room. He is currently the assistant professor of philosophy at Hong Kong University. Not only that, he is an expert in political philosophy, he's also an expert on many things, including geopolitics, international relations, and what's going on in ASEAN. I'm going to ask him about his current trip from Vietnam, what he has learned on the ground over there. All right, so this is the last time that I will call them formally. I'm just going to use the first name to call each of them to save time because you're here to listen to them, not to me. So my first question is to Karen. Just to warm up, I'm an economist and you are too. This is our comfort zone. I hate to speak about geopolitics because I can easily cross some red lines. By doing that, but economics is my comfort zone and I know exactly what I'm talking about. So my first question is, we are facing quite a lot of global economic challenges, right? Let me just list out some of them, right? We are having 2 wars, one in the Middle East, one in Europe. Inflation is still very high, very persistent. Central banks around the world are trying to fight inflation by jacking up the interest rate, increasing the cost of business. And here in Hong Kong, we have a US dollar peg. So interest rate is very high and people are not investing as much and suffer from very heavy mortgage payments. So now we are out of the pandemic, but we are still facing persistent geopolitical tension, especially between China and the United States. So I just want to hear your view about what we can do in this region or between US and China to deal with this sort of global economic challenges.
Sure. Oh, good. This is on. Yeah. So thank you. It is just terrific to be here and such an honor to be part of this conversation with such a distinguished panel. So let me talk about global economic challenges. As you said, that's our comfort zone. Let me start by being broad. I see kind of three areas of challenges. I would say the first one is the one that you spent some time on, which is returning inflation, back to target levels. After the pandemic, we saw the surge of inflation. It was caused by too much demand and these obstacles to supply that had to do with the pandemic and with the war, as you said. And then I will say, thanks to an aggressive policy response, central banks have been able to, in part, I think there were other forces at play, bring inflation considerably back towards target levels. And here I would say the advanced economies, I think we should also give credit to some of the emerging economies who kind of took lessons from the past and moved with monetary policy even before the advanced economies. But the good news would be that inflation has fallen a whole bunch. And that's been good, because the high inflation we learned was not only kind of causing a lot of hardship for people, it was causing kind of political problems in a lot of countries. In the United States, people were just angry about the inflation. I would say the other piece of good news is that it did not cause a global recession, which would have been just devastating in this time when we have all these wars going on, these geopolitical kind of tensions. But countries, differs across countries, but countries have done, pretty well. I don't think we're out of the woods yet, because, inflation is still 1 to 2 percentage points above target levels. And a lot of people, myself included, think that going this last mile could inflict some pain on economies. But I would say so far so good. And that's good, because as you know, there are these spillovers. Our tight monetary policy has had implications for many countries in Asia who have had to kind of raise interest rates at the same time. So in a sense, I think we've kind of exported some of our inflation. I would just say, I want to say a second challenge, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I want to get to longer term issues, would just be countries restoring their economies post-COVID. So the rich countries have done pretty well. The United States, we're kind of back to where we were prior to COVID in terms of trend growth. That's because we were able to mount this vigorous policy response, some monetary but largely fiscal policy response. But there are a lot of countries, particularly lower income countries around the world, who have had to battle inflation the past few years and kind of got distracted from what they were trying to do, restore their economies. But their economic activity and their labor markets are still in trouble. But then I would say that kind of the third area of challenges are the longer term challenges. And I think these challenges are again, it's I feel like, with kids, you talk about parallel play. I think these challenges are something that are inflicting a lot of countries in the world, our part of the world, your part of the world, and we all should be kind of working together. But I think, the big challenge, big picture is that we need to find a way to attain inclusive, sustainable economic growth. And one big issue there is high government debt. This is, the cost of these vigorous fiscal responses, or even the less vigorous fiscal responses in some countries, is that countries have exited the pandemic with a lot of debt, with levels of debt relative to GDP that are higher than they've been in decades. And, this is being exacerbated by, countries need to spend more to meet supply chain challenges and climate challenges. It's being exacerbated by demographics. This is another thing that we have in common with this part of the world. A lot of Asia is ahead of us on this, but birth rates have fallen in the United States as well. Population is aging. It's being exacerbated by higher interest rates, which is making debt more costly. We're going to have to kind of make hard choices to address this situation, but we have to make these choices, because if we don't, the debt is going to crowd out growth. It's going to, constrain countries as they try to respond to crises, and it's, possibly going to create these sovereign debt crises. The last kind of part of the kind of longer term challenge that I want to mention is just income inequality. Within countries, we've seen this last couple of decades, particularly in the advanced economy world, has seen this big rise in income inequality. We understand that, I think people that you meet on the street will like to say that's because of globalization, but the economic research tells us it's largely because of technology. And I think this is an issue, that the AI, although it holds the promise to increase productivity, maybe help us with our fiscal challenge, it also may end up displacing a whole bunch of people in a way that exacerbates income inequality. I think it's not only then that's within countries. Between if you look at inequality between countries, I worry a lot about deglobalization, causing kind of a reversal in some of the progress we've made, kind of bringing some countries up, kind of closer to other countries in terms of standards of living. But then when you think about kind of AI and the potential for that to displace people, not only in advanced economies but in kind of lower income countries, that's another thing that worries me a lot. So, as with government debt, I think, we don't know what to do about it, and this is something countries need to work on together.
Great. So let me ask a follow-up question. So we know from your sharing just now, interest rates will remain to be high. A lot of government, due to quite a lot of fiscal stimulus and monetary expansion during COVID, they're heavily indebted. So high interest rates are not going to help them to slowly alleviate, some of this sort of debt burden. But as a former Federal Reserve staff, former Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy and Treasury, I want to ask you, when will the U.S. interest rate start coming down, and how far would it go down by the end of next year? I mean, now you're no longer with them, right? So your own personal opinion. We're
in our comfort zone here, talking about as equilibrium interest rates, as we would say. Let me get out my crystal ball. I think central banks, the U.S. central bank, but also central banks around the world, they're reaching the ends of their tightening cycles. Because we have made a lot of, a year ago, I was just very worried that inflation was just going to either stay high or go up further. And kind of what's happened over the past year has been very remarkable, very encouraging, that inflation has receded. This is not like kind of the late 1970s and the early 1980s, as we were talking about before. And I think that's giving central bankers, even though they continue to talk tough, for good reason, because they're trying to maintain credibility and keep inflationary psychology from setting in. But I think given the progress we've made, they're kind of done tightening. A big debate over kind of when they're going to start cutting rates. My best guess is that we'll be cutting rates by the middle of next year in the United States. But if you look at the forecast for kind of where rates are going to go from here, kind of both what we're seeing from central banks and the private sector, is that they're not going to come down very fast. And I think this is related to what I was saying before, that, getting the last bits of inflation out, wringing that out, getting inflation back to the target might kind of take longer than we thought. I think when all is said and done, you said, where are we going over the longer run? Interest rates are going to be higher. Not as high as they were in the early 1990s, not back to those days, but they're going to be higher than the very low rates that we saw in the 2010s. And that's partly because of all the government debt I was talking about. I mean, that government debt is kind of, it's soaking up, savings around the world. And so governments are going to have to compete, and that's going to keep interest rates higher.
Thank you, Karen. So I'm going to ask you more questions about the US. After I ask a question to Eric about China. So I know you have been running a very successful private equity firm in Shanghai. You probably experienced quite a long period of lockdown in Shanghai. So after the end of zero COVID, people expected, a solid economic recovery. But it seems that the news, especially the Western news, describe economic recession, long time slowdown, all sort of social economic issues that China is suffering. So from your perspective, running a very successful business, running a think tank in Shanghai, tell us a little bit about your perspectives about China, and what did the West sort of get wrong about China?
So I think what's happening in our economy and our business is that we're going through a fairly painful process of economic restructuring. And this restructuring is being done from top down on the supply side by political initiative, not by market forces, right? And it's necessarily painful. So what is happening is, if you look at our economy in the last 20 years, where I grew up in, the three drivers or pillars of our economy, market economy, and not the infrastructure the government does. What are they? Real estate, which is huge, accounts for about a third of our GDP. Consumer internet platforms, and low-end manufacturing, since we joined the WTO. Yeah. So basically, I think all three had sort of run out of steam in the middle of the last decade. 2015, 2016, the total factor productivity has been stagnant and dropping. So it's like revenue is growing, but margin is not. Okay. Now, if we keep going at that, I mean, we're participating in that. We're investing a huge amount of capital in these three pillars. Okay. So I call it a gross market misallocation of capital. And the political leadership had decided that market forces could not be relied upon to engineer a restructuring that's much needed. If we keep going at this rate, we will be stuck in the so-called middle income trap, and we'll never win this competition with America. You know, so what we want the economy to go is to go away from these older growth drivers into new growth drivers, and these new growth drivers have two directions. Okay, one is what I call technology-enabled industrial capacity. So if you look at China's position in the world, our biggest asset is our industrial capacity. We have the largest industrial capacity in the world. It's bigger than the US, Germany, Japan put together. Okay, about 33-4% of the world's industrial output. Okay, and it's worth about 5 to 10 trillion US dollars a year, bigger than most countries, huge. But the value add of that industrial capacity is still relatively low. I mean, I calculated around 12%. So if you look at the 5 to 10 trillion industrial output as our revenue of a company, then the 12% value add is like our gross margin. Okay. If you look at the US in the 1970s, when they were at the height of their industrial power, their gross margin is about 35 to 40%. Huge. Okay. So it's that 30 percentage point gap on the denominator of 5 to 10 trillion US dollars. That's the money we need to go make. If we don't make that money, our people can never live as well as the Americans. It's as simple as that. But capital is not being invested in those directions. Capital, like the capital I was investing in, we're going for the, trying to get another Tencent out of this. Get another Alibaba, get another game company, or other people. I don't do real estate, but that's even bigger. So they want capital going to sectors where we inject more real technology. If you look at the last 20 years, we got these big tech companies, right? As big as the American companies, but the level of technological innovation is extremely low. I mean, these are mostly business model innovations that changed our lives. The ubiquitous QR code, that was invented in when I was in high school. It's nothing new. If we had not screwed up on semiconductor, we'd be doing much better. But no, we screwed that one up, right? So of the 30 percentage point gap, maybe 8 points is semiconductors. I like to use the iPhone story. When Apple began to make the iPhone in China 10 years ago, all the iPhones are made in China. Yeah. It's a $1,000 product. We kept 3.5%. Now the number is up to 26%. big accomplishment, 10 years. We need to repeat the iPhone story in every sector. If we make the chip, it'll be 65%. Okay, but we don't. All right, so in the technology-enabled industrial capacity. Second are new sectors, new industries that are driven by technology innovation on day one. That's where China is leading in many ways. EV, for instance, right? Alternative energy, new materials, synthetic biology. So all these things, I think China does have a decent advantage in keeping a leadership position. So they want to invest more. So that this is the economic restructuring, a top-down supply-side economic restructuring that is happening, and market forces are slow to respond, and consumers are slow to respond. So by necessity, we're going through a lot of pain. It's you know, China's balance sheet is very healthy. We don't have any foreign debt. We got a lot of capital. I mean, there are so many tools in the economic toolbox. I mean, every economist, I go to them and say, why aren't they using these tools? You know, they got all these tools. They got more tools than the Americans. But I finally figured it out. You know, if they want the economy to fly next week, it will fly next week. But the economy that flies up is not the economy they want. They want a different economy. So we're like a patient in bed. They're giving the patient just enough oxygen so he stays alive. If you give him more oxygen, he will grow bigger, and it's not the human being you want. So they want to wait till the actual restructuring, the people that we directly participate, complete that restructuring. So then when they give them oxygen, it grows into someone they want, the economy they want. So that's what's happening. So I think this process will take another couple of years.
Eric, I completely agree with you about sort of the direction of development, right? You know, China wants a modernized socialist economy with probably more equal distribution of wealth and income, more focus on sustainability, more digital transformation. But the speed of adjustment is the key here, right? Like you're saying, just to give the patient enough oxygen, maybe they undershot, right? They didn't know that is not enough or not enough, and sometimes like the patient may die before they can even have
shock therapy.
a better economy.
Exactly. So I think we're going through a tough period. So we're going back. I mean, this year I think we'll have 5% growth, plus minus 0.1, 0.2. So it's good enough to stay alive, and it's a very difficult balance to get. But that's what the government's trying to do. And then, but they want to, and can market forces respond? Is the question.
But on this part, right, we are chit-chatting, right? Because I actually wrote down a bunch of questions. I realized, you know, once Eric talked, I lost my patience to read my questions. I just want to ask a lot of follow-up before I turn to Tony. That is, so it seems like there's some contradiction in, you know, the way that you talk about the relationship between the state and the market, right? So it's a top-down approach. I agree with you. And you also said, you know, the market did not respond enough, but the market actually didn't know how to respond, right? You know, when there's so much policy uncertainty, as I was told, or maybe, you know, the new normal in China is really sort of expansion of state-owned enterprises, not so much about private sector development. But, you know, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm happy to.
The market's like a puppy. You got to train it. So I think, you know, look, there are two Chinas. Okay, there are two Chinese economies. If you go to the people who are making billions in the last 20 years, they're downbeat. They're moving to Singapore. Okay. And I say, stay there. So we have less competition at home. So all these people, they don't know how to, the reason they're moving to Singapore is because they don't know how to make money in that new economy that's coming, hopefully. They only know how to make money in the last 20, in that model. Right. So they're pissed off. Okay. They're like a low-level accountant being replaced by AI. Okay. So they're moving to Singapore and retire, which is good. But if you go to Alibaba, let's not mention any company's name, if you go to these companies, real estate companies, you're gonna, internet platforms, you'll get that. If you go to CATL, which I've been to 2 times in the last 6 months, okay, huge company already, $100 billion company. Every worker, every driver to CEO, every engineer is working 16 hours a day. They can't stop. If you go to BYD, okay, if you go to some of these earlier stage manufacturing technology companies that just got funded by venture capital firms like mine, you feel that you're back in 2000. Okay, so it's the 2 economies, and the people who are speaking loudly, making a lot of noise, are the first group, because the second group is too busy.
Yeah. Very good, Eric. I'm sure they want to hear more from you, but I need to turn to Tony at the moment because he has been studying the development of the Chinese economy in the last 4 decades, I may say. He has experience through research and from his eyes, 改革开放, right? How China was opened up since the 80s and joined the WTO, become a very important manufacturing powerhouse. You also studied quite a lot of institutional changes in China. So, after hearing what Eric said, could you help us to think about what would happen to China in the long run in terms of its economic structure, but also in terms of the political regime, right? Based on what had happened in the last 4 decades.
Actually, quite surprisingly, I find myself in agreement with Eric, which I had not expected. However, there is one point at which I will diverge a little bit. I think one of the really important things from what Eric is talking about, and this is what Washington needs to hear, is that Washington has sort of gone through different phases. First it was, the Chinese economic juggernaut is going on. It's going to be the big challenge. We have to deal with that. Now the worrying trend is the idea of peak China, that China's peaked and policy begins to shift to accommodate that. And I think what is important from what Eric is saying is, yes, there is a peak, but it's a necessary fundamental transition within the economy. And I think people in the US need to understand that this isn't the end of the Chinese growth story. It's shifting to a different kind of track. And I think that's extremely important for us to understand. Now, whether they're going to be able to meet the objectives they're setting out, we can argue, we can debate about that, but it's very important. I think if I look at policy from Beijing, and obviously security has become a big issue in terms of economic practice. And, if you look from Beijing, where were the 3 major threats to the Chinese system? Well, it was real estate, the way platform economies were operating, and the financial system, which was really not transparent and very problematic. So, yes, top down, some can argue it was too brutal, that maybe it happened too quickly, but those were areas which really presented fundamental dangers, I think, to the Chinese economy. So there I would agree with Eric that needed to be sorted out and to be restructured. I have 2 or 3 other comments, sort of thinking about what you were talking about. And the next comment really relates to this whole question of debt, and particularly local government debt, which is now all over the newspapers and is really pushing on local governments, again, to shift the strategy of development that they've been operating for many years. So again, it's a necessary restructure that has to happen. I've always called this a transition debt. And what I mean by that is it was the central government decided to change the model of development. And it was the local governments that bore the cost of that. I think with the fiscal capacity the central government has, they should take on the responsibility for a lot of that local government debt, because it's been really distorting the development model at the local level. And it's led to the land acquisition, the real estate, all the things that we know about. And it relates, secondly, to who has the responsibility to cover the costs of public services and infrastructure. Again, as we know, 90+% of health, education, infrastructure, local policing costs, etc., are borne by the local government, not by the central state. And that's an untenable situation, particularly if the central government keeps introducing, now we have, everybody has to have this, everybody has to have that, but you're going to pay for it. And they don't have mechanisms to access cash to be able to do that. So we see the local government financing vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. So this is something I've been arguing for 20 plus years, that the central government really needs to take the responsibility for that and clear it out, and then set a different system, which may be property taxes, maybe other areas, and so on. The slowdown in the economy, I think what Eric is touching on is right. I would actually see it in terms of three different sort of factors which are causing the slowdown in the economy. And it's natural. I mean, China's never going to keep growing at 10, 12%, so on and so forth. The first is that many of the factors that drove a lot of that initial growth in China have gone away. The demographic dividend, the initial benefit of global integration, benefits coming from foreign direct investment, the kind of catch-up growth, those are all gone. They're all in the past. Where can China still gain benefits is investment in education. That seems to me, Eric, where you're talking about what the needs are for this economy moving forward, it needs a much better educated workforce. And it needs a much better educated workforce in the countryside. Because it's all well and good if we look at that developing, these startup companies, they're doing well, and they're in the urban areas, you've still got hundreds of millions of people in the countryside who do not have access to the kind of educational skills that they're going to need to operate in that economy. So I think that is still one area where the government, it's invested a lot in education in the past, it's been successful, but it's one of those initial factors which hasn't really run its course. And I think there's a lot more to gain out of that. Then there's the cyclical, the post-COVID boom, yes, we expected that. And then the kind of slowing of the economy. 5%, I don't know, I'd probably come nearer 4, 3.5, 4, but yeah, anyway, that's a quibble. But then there are policy choices, I think, which have become important. And I think this begins to come into the areas that you've been talking about, where I don't necessarily have a disagreement with what you're talking about now, but I do wonder, are they the correct policy choices, and will they stay in place when this readjustment has been completed? That to me is the real problem and the real question around it. Because often what we've seen in so many different countries, once the state gets in, it's very difficult to get it out again. And in China, the state hasn't been very innovative in that sense. And actually, a lot of, you know better than I do, a lot of the government innovation funds have been waste and so forth. So I think I talked already about the debt fuel model of development. That day is gone, obviously, and now it's doing the cleanup for that. And I think that's the responsibility of the central government. The declining total factor productivity, particularly in the state sector, I think is a huge problem. And also the ways in which prioritizing security cuts into some of the economic decision making, I think will be a challenge for China moving forward. So I think as this restructuring takes place without policy change accompanying it, I fear there's a problem that it might get caught in a rut without being able to take advantage of the adjustment that you're talking about. We need re-engagement of the private sector. And there's nonsense in the West, the private sector has been crushed in China. I mean, that's rubbish for anybody who's been to China. Obviously, it's not right. Much more consumer driven. And of course, these are changes that the government has been talking about since at least 2002, 2003, that old model doesn't work and it needs a fundamental shift. I think the problem there, though, is that gets caught up then in the politics. Can you have the kind of redistribution of wealth that China needs and the reallocation of resources that China needs without it becoming politically divisive? And I don't mean we don't know the answer to that, but it is a major challenge and I think a potential block for China, because it's going to cut across a lot of the vested interests in the system, and vested interests which have been baked in over a very long period of time. So that's more where my concern comes in, Eric, not so much with what you're talking about with the readjustment, but can you get to that point where then more engaged market forces, consumer demand, income redistribution can kick in a way that takes China forward, or does it get locked into a state-dominated system, which might prevent it getting towards a more what you refer to as socialist modern state? Although I must admit I don't really know what that means, but still.
I'm going to give a chance to Eric to define that in the second round. But do you have any response, Eric? Very quick one.
I think you're exactly right, and all the rest.
This is awful.
Yeah, I know.
Something's going wrong in the world.
Yeah, but there are two things to it. I think. I think you're exactly right. We're like, just like the U.S. or Roman empires. There's so much friction in the system. So many vested interests. It's maddening.
Yeah.
We're not as bad as the U.S., but we're getting there. So that's probably the rationale. I'm not making a judgment. I mean, I do have a judgment, but I'm not selling my judgment on whether it's right. That's probably the rationale for centralized political power.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you can't九龙治水, we all know that term. Can't have that anymore. Too many vested. So you need to centralize power. So that's one. And second is, don't underestimate market forces. We still have too many hungry people, like hungry. Okay, this is like 长江后浪推前浪. One wave dies or go to Singapore rich. The next wave hungry, they just come, they do whatever it takes. And I'm seeing it on the ground. They're not being reported, like I said, because they're not talking. But another amazing thing that's happening in my life, in my business, is that in the venture capital business, in the last 20 years, when we travel, I live in Shanghai. I go to Beijing and Shenzhen, maybe Hangzhou. That's it, because that's where the big techs in the company. Now when I travel, I go everywhere. I went to places I never heard of, because all the new innovations are happening in these industrial sectors, and they have different industrial clusters in the different provinces. So we're finding startup companies, technology companies in places we never heard of. So it's very interesting. So all that is happening. I mean, you should go check it out.
So on that, Eric, I agree with you. I actually don't understand why there's still so many hungry people and entrepreneurs in China, given how tough the environment is. I'm going to come back to you, or you have a short answer to this? Is it in the genes, or it's just the Chinese characteristic?
No, it's just the way the people are, and also I can't, I study political science, so my biggest questions, they make very little money, the government officials, or they get corrupt and go to jail. Why so many people still want to go into government service? It's in the genes.
Okay, so you agree with me. All right. So I put Tony and Eric to sit next to each other, expecting some more debate, but I'm surprised that they're actually agreeing with each other more than I expected. But
some variance, but I think Eric is absolutely right about the necessity for that economic readjustment. They've been talking about it for 20 years.
Yes.
It's time.
Okay, great. Let me turn to Edward. Edward is running a very important initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School, which is called the Asia Energy and Sustainability Initiative. First of all, could you tell us a little bit about what you are trying to do with that initiative, and also share with us a little bit about what's going on in Asia in terms of alternative energy market? And in that space, we have been told many times that this is almost the last area where the US and China can work on together. But has there been any progress in terms of collaboration across US and Chinese companies in the energy market?
Sure. Well, again, thanks again for having all of us here. We're excited. It's wonderful to see such a large group and I think, what will be an engaged group. I think, so good questions. For me, when I look, if we start in terms of Asia, right? It's a big place. If we start the places where we tend to operate the most, where we're doing a lot of research, teaching, training, have a lot of fellows. Let's start with China as one example. When you look at clean energy and the transition, it's quite it's been my sort of professional life. So I'm 47. 1996 is when I got hooked on Chinese energy market questions and industrial policy and how the party and the state were shaping these investment decisions. For me, it's been an incredible ride because it's a paradox, right, fundamentally. So when you look at China and its energy system, it is the world's, on the one hand, the world's largest wind market, the largest solar market. But on the other hand, so that green giant is, on the flip side, also a big fossil black giant at the exact same time. And because you also have 4.3 billion tons of coal, right? So more than well over half the world's coal burned in China. So that paradox is sort of what the world is in many ways trying to figure out, right? Because as China goes, so does the world, right? If you think about that scale, right, as you all live here in this region, that scale has driven global clean energy trends and, of course, emissions. So just to give some examples and then link it to the work we do, that level of revolutionary cost reduction, let's say with solar first, led to enormous change. So when I think of, and this maybe will get to you as well from your recent trip in Vietnam, and I look at the work that we do in Vietnam, there's been enormous progress where the Vietnamese government and that Communist Party has benefited by making pretty significant changes in their energy policy and by taking advantage of Chinese reductions in solar cost, have ramped much more than any of us, particularly specialists even at Bloomberg and other places, imagined, right? Huge uptake of utility scale solar, right? So on the one hand, that real revolution in cost had huge impact. Even looking at the United States, right, the number one, the vast majority of solar jobs are in installation. Why? When you run surveys of those companies, why are you hiring? Because of the incredibly low cost of solar power, solar panels. So the flip side, though, of course, and this is just, I'm using this as a quick way to look at the diversity of outcomes in this part of the world. When we look at the work we do in Indonesia, the Indonesians have taken a different road, and they're focusing much more on China's coal demand and choosing to fill that demand through mining and through significant volumes of coal exports, right? Sort of putting a lot of bets on that. So you can just see that tension within China, of course, is a tension within the region, given China's massive both economic influence, but also increasing its political influence. So if you look through the window of wind, for example, we see the exact same revolution in cost reduction. That this is right after solar. This happened in onshore, but it's also happening in offshore, right? There, it gets a little more complicated. Right? So the extent to which that revolution will have an impact in this region interests me, again going back to our work in Vietnam, because it's an example of where, and I'll go to a couple of examples in a bit, where that economic story, that incredible revolution in cost, runs into the buzzsaw of national security. Where, for me, it's quite interesting in our discussions with both the party and the state in Vietnam, is to what extent are guardrails and real obstacles being put up against a lot of that offshore build out by Chinese firms, as an example, given the very sensitive waters in which they could operate. So when it comes to the US and China, I find I've again been lucky to live through a real turn, right? A real shift. If you look at the fundamental relationship, like you said, it has been in my sector, when you look at energy and the environment, it has been one largely for decades of cooperation. And it made sense, right? But why? If you look at the relationship and exchange, or since the 1960s, really 70s, it was mostly science and technology that laid the foundation for the relationship of exchange. And a lot of that actually was focused on energy and the environment from the beginning. What's been so interesting to me is that wonderful complementarity between sort of R&D, very strong R&D in the United States upstream, and then deployment downstream in China, has obviously shifted. What we now see is, in some ways, a competition, but for me, often the competition is not always a bad thing, right? So I think we tend to look at the US and China and that geopolitical struggle in highly negative terms. There are obviously negative issues and externalities. However, when it comes to certain issues, again, back to this question of clean energy, the competition is important. I actually wish we were a bit more competitive, at least on the US side, because Chinese financing, of course, has led to significant build out of infrastructure, the majority being fossil, external, outside of China, right? So exporting of overcapacity and things of that sort, but also among private companies, a lot of renewable infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure. I think that's where the US should be a little bit more competitive with China. We have certain, both through our former colleague at USAID, through a development finance and investment vehicle as well. The US is, of course, out there, is providing alternative financing, but not a lot of it. That's just one example. So in that sense, I sort of I would want to see more competition so that there's more alternative to financing, particularly of infrastructure. I also see that, as I mentioned before, it's interesting how in the US, when you look at our own clean energy shift, there are real now constraints to what we can do in the United States, and because of these political, the politically driven tariffs, because of the tensions where, while for some good reasons around subsidies and other criticisms of China, this all began under really Obama sort of second term, and then really ramped under Trump, and then systematized in a way under Biden. It is true, of course, that for the United States, whether it's trying to achieve our electric vehicles or resilience in terms of that supply chain, again, back to solar, and those tariffs on panels have had an impact on our build out. We're seeing that there's a fundamental tension there. So when I just want to close with our own work at the Kennedy School has been very much in the middle of all of this, which has been wonderful to both participate in and to help expand. So just a couple examples. Let's just follow those kind of principal countries of China, Vietnam, and Indonesia just for time. In China, what we began with was through training. So training not only of government, but also of like the China Southern Power Grid, right? So this is the much more market-oriented, much more renewable-facing of the two grids in China. And in the mid-2000s, one of the major challenges they faced was, how do we integrate more and more renewables? What are the equity impacts of doing that, particularly on the poor? How do you create a dynamic yet stable and secure grid? How do we think about innovation and venture capital within the firm versus outside the firm, make or buy questions? And so we ran for several years a really fascinating executive education program around those questions, right? Building answers, right, to those types of questions. That then linked to a whole bunch of research related to grid integration of renewables. In Vietnam, we're doing the same, right? So now they're a little bit later in that curve, but they're moving rapidly, as I mentioned. And there we have a 30-year relationship with the Fulbright, what was originally a Fulbright Economics Training Program, now the Fulbright University of Vietnam. That's both research on their own grid integration challenges with renewables as they ramp up solar, same kind of questions, but also on entrepreneurs, of how young clean tech entrepreneurs can access capital, how policy in Vietnam should shift to nurture those entrepreneurs. And we do that through a partnership with YSEALI, the Young Southeast Asia Leadership Institute, and Fulbright University of Vietnam. And then lastly, moving forward, we have a new project that looks at the impact of Chinese green finance in this part of the world, particularly Southeast Asia, not just in terms of its outcomes, in terms of infrastructure, but even more importantly, I'd argue on standards and how standards are changing. Because of course, the U.S.-China tension is not just about sort of guns and butter, right? It's also about standards and about the ways in which industries are being created from scratch and also shifting. Finance is one aspect of that, and green finance is a particularly interesting aspect of it because it has long tail, a long lag, because it affects, particularly in infrastructure, a long cycle. So that's sort of a bit of how I sort of see the region, how it's changing, particularly in terms of clean energy, and also how it links to our own work.
Edward, follow-up question. Would you agree that in this part of the world, countries like China and Vietnam are actually more committed to fight climate change compared to where you're from?
That's a good indirect way of saying. I like to say my mother's Italian, so first of all, I mean, I come from many. How
about Italy? Is Italy doing?
So there's many different hats I can wear if you want, in terms of cultural identity. So yes, I would say again, it depends, right? So let's look at COP28, right? So that's currently the conference of the parties is having right now. So my hat's obviously off to my former senator and Secretary of State John Kerry, who's special envoy, climate envoy for President Biden. He and Xie Zhenhua have had heroic efforts and a couple of very important things they've done, right? Not just sort of Paris Agreement, but methane. There's the global stock taking. I hope people focus on that for those of you interested in the environment. That's a pretty important metric about where countries are that's coming out of COP. So there are some great things that are happening between our countries. I'll get to you to what you're driving at in a second, but I think it's important to state that's real, and I'm happy about what we're seeing on that. The flip side is, in terms of commitment, COP is also revealing things, right? So everything you can both, I think these types of conferences are very interesting because most of the deals have already been negotiated, obviously, but they also bring to the fore things that we don't all know ahead of time. So one example would be in Indonesia, despite being part of this overall just energy transition, right, which is what Kerry, Xie Zhenhua, and others have been promoting and signing agreements with, from Vietnam to Indonesia to South Africa, Senegal. Despite those agreements, Indonesia, for example, has really already shown through COP and what they've publicly stated that they're actually reneging on capping their carbon emissions from their power sector, as an example, because it ends up that they have quite a bit of which most of us sort of knew but didn't know the extent of. Their off-grid coal is huge, gigantic coal-fired power. So that's an example of where commitments are already starting to push back, to recede. I think you're also seeing on the U.S. side a bit of receding commitment, not just, as I said before, in terms of money. So this loss and damage fund, where there's a very, both from an ethics perspective and political philosophy perspective, but also from a very realistic, pragmatic perspective, where they're not the funds in the developing world to mitigate and adapt to climate, despite the fact that most of those costs, the majority of those costs, are in the developing world. That's complicated, obviously, from the U.S. perspective, but in some ways we've seen already shrink, despite what John Kerry has been stating. Very difficult. You don't see as much action in terms of the money, right, for that fund. So yes, I would say the U.S. has certainly not walked the walk internationally as much as we talk the talk. The flip side is you have to give credit, given how complicated Congress is, give credit to what Biden has done, at least domestically, to push through an Inflation Reduction Act, pretty significant shift. I mean, definitely significant shifts in terms of the costs of clean energy and the ways in which powers of the state, of the federal government, are being deployed right to that goal. But now, of course, as an academic, am I going to be happy with? Can I criticize the United States? Absolutely, because I see the urgency, right, of the problem. But unfortunately, I also see some slippage even here.
Well, I didn't mean to criticize the U.S., but
Right,
you
yeah.
gave us a
I'll
very
do it for
complete.
you. Yeah. We're very good at that.
You gave me a very complete picture about the challenges that policymakers are facing, within the U.S. And climate change is a very challenging issue that requires big countries to all contribute and work together. So let me turn to Brian, because Brian has been patiently waiting for an hour. I didn't know the first round will last for an hour. So my question to you is very easy. You're a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. So yesterday I sent him the questions. I said, well, you got your PhD in 4 years. And then he corrected me first by saying only 3 years. And then I said, oh, sorry, you make me look dumb, I said. And then not only did he not try to comfort me, he replied by saying, by the way, it's 2.5 years because I submitted my PhD thesis early. But anyhow, with such a distinguished academic record, you must have a lot of outside options, right? I know you were born and raised here. Why did you choose to come back to Hong Kong? What can Hong Kong do in this very complicated geopolitical environment? And what other countries in the region do you think can contribute a little bit when the biggest economies are fighting?
Well, thank you very much, Hei. First and foremost, I got 中國香港人嚟, I was born and raised in Hong Kong, spent 17 years here in the city, and I moved over to Blighty and spent 8 years in Oxford. And when I decided or announced I was coming back rather to Hong Kong, the emails I got, the messages I got, all started with, are you mad? And also, why would you do that? And of course, as the odd sardonic message, I would say, well, good luck with that. I'm sure I will not see you for quite some time, if ever. And to all of these naysayers, I would say the reason why I opted to come back to Hong Kong is multifold, but they're really just 3 very straightforward reasons. The first is I see myself as an Asian who's benefited from engaging and interlocuting with elements of the West, elements of the global North, and the global South as well. But first and foremost, I believe in the future of Asia. Secondly, I'm Chinese. I see myself as a part of this sprawling, not monolithic, in many ways deeply heterogeneous entity of 1.4 billion people that is imperfect, that is flawed, that needs to improve, that has, and will remain a work in progress. And yet, if I want to be in a room where it happens, then I have to be back here, as opposed to pontificating on China and writing on a country from afar. And the final reason is I'm a Hong Konger, and I'm proud of being raised as a son of this very city. So I'll delve into them one by one in a bit more detail, starting first with Asia, because I think the panel today has been terrific in encompassing and surveying many of the issues and also cleavages between China and the US and beyond. What I appreciated in particular about Ed's comments just then is he looked at Southeast Asia and also what we might proverbially refer to as the global South, so to speak. And yet when we think about Asia, it's worth remembering this is a continent with 60% of the world's population, where Southeast Asia alone is 667, maybe 670 million, depending on your census, people with an average life expectancy that's amongst the youngest out of all the regions in the world. This is an incredibly vibrant and diverse region just to the south of us, with 10 members in ASEAN, soon to be 11. And then in Central Asia, you see countries trying to balance, and very strategically and definitely so, between China, Russia, India, EU, and of course the United States. And even in Northeast Asia, where I feel like we haven't quite touched upon or done justice to our brothers and sisters in Japan and Korea. These are countries that exemplify and epitomize how Northeast Asian, proverbially Confucian in Korea or non-Confucian cultures can be so dynamic and vibrant with their soft power exporting and also engagement with constructing an advanced service economy and consumption-oriented economy and beyond. So Asia is a wonderful continent. I think it's high time we recognize the eclecticity and the fact that it is by no means a single Asian story, as Dr. Fung highlighted just then. And of course, let us not forget the most populous country in the world today, which is not China anymore. And I hate to break the news here, not that those who are really in China would actually care, but I hate to break the news to many that India is now the most populous nation in the world. And the politics of each and every one of the states within India, in Tamil Nadu, you've got a nominally Marxist ruling party that is anything but Marxist in practice, even the leader's called MK Stalin. And then you've also got in Kerala, a small, quaint, and yet economically advanced state that epitomizes what India could become if it takes on a more south-oriented approach in its growth trajectory. All of this is to say that I think Asia is a fascinating, vibrant, and deeply vivacious and dynamic place to be in. And Hong Kong as a leading Asian city, as a hub, as a center for talent and thinkers and intellectual traditions, as a confluence for ideals, can most certainly serve as a cosmopolis for me, as an academic interested in philosophy, interested in ethics, to observe Asia from up close, from point zero, so to speak. The second point I want to make concerns China. And I think when it comes to China, there's a temptation to sort of slip into essentialisms that I'm very grateful that no one on the panel today has, because, you know, everyone that Dr. Fung and Hei have invited, and of course from HKS, who come here, are incredibly astute and balanced and nuanced. Sadly, the same can't be said of 99.9% of the discourse we hear out there. You know, we have folks who are trying to channel the inner Gordon Changs, masquerading as, I'm predicting the real doom and demise of China. Gordon predicted it 20 years early, all the way through to, you know, incredibly gung-ho and nationalistic voices that say China's going to win and prevail, and the US and Europe, all of you, you know, you're forgettable, you're irrelevant. But I think the nuanced views we have here today in our panel discussion lie somewhere in the middle. And this is also how I see China. I think China has huge promises and also huge potential in its transition to advanced manufacturing, with its lead in AI and quantum computing, despite the sort of bottlenecks that the US is trying to impose when it comes to, you know, semiconductors and also chips, right? And I did read Secretary Raimondo's remarks today. Thank you very much. I thought they were terrifically honest, and they also told us, you know, what exactly the US is up to here. Despite all of these challenges, China is making progress, and China has succeeded in many ways that, frankly, few other countries and economies have over the past 40 years of 改革开放. But this is also a country that needs to confront questions of confidence, a crisis of confidence, a private sector of entrepreneurs that do not necessarily know where to go or where to invest because they are puppies, as described by Eric just then, who are somewhat unleashed and therefore have lost a sense of direction. This is also a country that needs to govern with complex governance issues across municipalities and localities. Few observers around the world seem to understand how complex and how much variation there is between Xinjiang and Tibet, Guangzhou, you know, and Shenzhen within the same province, within Guangdong, within GBA. If I were to comment accurately and write accurately and fairly on China, and to judiciously play a role in its continuous reform and opening up, I told myself, I can't afford to be in New York, you know. I could ill afford to be in Oxford, as lovely and idyllic as it is, you know. It's a city of dreaming spies, but it doesn't really inspire much confidence when it comes to work on China, especially, you know, given the removal, or the distance rather, from China proper. I have to be back on Chinese soil. And why Hong Kong in relation to that? Well, it's very simple. As a financier friend, a very senior one, once told me in a private conversation, he said, you know, Brian, I will know when one country, two systems finished the moment I can no longer criticize, you know, the mainland. Because there are lots of things I can say here in Hong Kong that I cannot say in Beijing, in Shanghai, or in Guangzhou today. I can talk about the Chinese economy. I can talk about what George Yeo, the former foreign minister of Singapore, talked about in his opening remarks in HKU, which will be uploaded very shortly, thank you very much, where he talked about a tragedy, or rather what some would perceive and see as a tragedy in China in the late 1980s. He opened with that line, and I don't think George, you know, even being George, would do that in a mainland. This is one country, two systems. This is the epitomization of 改革开放, of the continuous ability of China to present itself in multitudes, in pluralities, in pluralisms, and not be captured or reduced into stereotypes, controlling images, defined by external commentators. To me, this is the role that Hong Kong could definitely play and still can play today. And that ties me on to the final point. I'm conscious of time. I'm a Hong Konger, and this is a brilliant city. This is a city defined by compactness. We're in Central right now, 10 minutes from here. Actually, no, 8 minutes on a taxi. You can get to the peak. We can see the entirety of Hong Kong unfolding and unfurling beneath your feet. You could spend an afternoon in Clearwater Bay and then cram in, as I once did, you know, 6 meetings between then and the end of the day in Central Admiralty Tsim Sha Tsui, followed by a trip to Jordan, and finally Shatton to cap off the trip. This is Hong Kong. We're close, we're proximate, we're mixed, we engage in bricolage, we're creative, we're entrepreneurial, we are diverse, and we are stronger because of our diversity. And when there are voices here locally who seek to snuff out diversity, who say that if you're gay, if you're lesbian, you cannot be because that's against national security, I say you have to talk to Beijing about that, because I'm pretty sure Beijing would not agree with you over that. When there are voices that say that Hong Kong should just become another mainland city, I say you're undermining not just the interests of the 7.5 million people here, you're also undermining the interests of the 1.4 billion of the entirety of China today. And the final point to note here is what can Hong Kong do in order to remain relevant? Because many people say, right, you know, when I travel abroad to conferences in New York and Paris, folks would say, oh, where are you from? And I say, Hong Kong. Oh, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? How did you get out? Oh, you must be one of those Erdais. That's how you got out. And I say, no, I'm not an Erdai. I'm an ordinary Hong Konger. And I'm out here because I can get out and you can come in freely. Now that we've lifted the sort of self-mutilating and undermining quarantine measures, which are completely counterproductive, mind you, we have managed to reopen ourselves to the world. Please come see for yourself. Because Hong Kong's not perfect. Don't buy into those who tell you that Hong Kong is 150% perfect. We're blessed, no problems, nothing to see here. Don't buy into that, because I don't either. But most certainly don't buy into narratives that portray us as dead, as stagnant, as hopeless. Because the very fact that we can have conversations like these here today, in this room, in this space, that's testament to the fact that we're alive and we're kicking and we're kickboxing. So as long as Hong Kong can keep kickboxing, finding ways of merging and blending and fusing the East and the West and the global North and the South, I'm hopeful for this city. And I hope you can join me in sharing this cautious, reserved, yet fundamentally, I hope, grounded optimism in this home to not me only, or to you, but to all of us. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Brian. I guess you guys don't need to be reminded that he was on the debate team of Oxford for many years. I asked you to debate, but not to fight for Hong Kong, but you did a very good job just now. I am fully aware of how much time we have left, but I still want to ask another round of very quick questions with hopefully some very quick responses before I turn to the audience for Q&A. So back to Karen. You have been patiently waiting for another hour. And so my first question to you is about the US economy. My second question is really about the global economy, especially related to what the multilateral organizations are doing when the world becomes more fragmented. So I remember studying international trade at MIT. All my professors told me the best model is the WTO multilateral model with multilateral liberalization, because it is not going to create distortions and trade diversion, all sorts of things. But right now we see that the Western-led multilateral institutions have not been playing their traditional roles to foster more international collaboration or even try to settle some of the conflicts that we are seeing every day. And at the same time, we started seeing China establishing quite a lot of new institutions and initiatives, right? The AIIB, the Belt and Road initiatives, and the original members of BRICS have invited 6 more members, including Argentina and Saudi Arabia, to join. So, when we are in a transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, should we be more realistic to accept the fact that, we need more multilateral organizations outside of the West to help in the meantime to solve and tackle some of the challenges before we get back to the multilateral discussion again? So a long question, sorry, but a very quick response, please.
Sure. I'll try a quick response. Can I just say I'm old school. I'm a fan of multilateral institutions. I think, the countries have common problems, pandemics, kind of AI, global surges in inflation that they need to kind of fight together. I think it's important for countries to provide, assistance to, countries that are troubled because of something idiosyncratic happening there. And I think that is facilitated by a multilateral system. I think the multilateral system is what fostered globalization and brought kind of these big benefits to countries, lifting people out of poverty. So I'm a fan of that system. I hope it hasn't gone away. But you're right. We have seen backsliding over the last 10, 20 years. And I think the U.S., has been part of that thanks to policies we put in place. We talked about, Edward talked about some of them already. Let me just say, I think, that's partly about, I worry about the future. I worry it's going to get worse, not better. I think it's partly about leaders. We have a presidential election coming up next year, and if it goes to Trump, we could see more backsliding. But even under President Biden, it's not like he has undone kind of the moves away from multilateralism that happened under President Trump. And I should say it's partly the leaders. It's partly reflecting kind of just deep inequities in our society that have enabled those leaders to kind of withdraw from the global economy. So just to get to your question, I think, first of all, I think the U.S. needs to do more. I mean, I should be totally clear. We should put more financial resources into our multilateral institutions, and we should just show more leadership. But we're not doing as much as we should be doing. And therefore, the world needs to kind of optimize according to constraints. And so therefore, I think we do need, countries do need to be pragmatic, and they do need to kind of come up with regional solutions, while we wait, I hope, for multilateralism to come back.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Sharp and crisp. So my next question is back to Eric, because, Tony has a question for you. It's a time for you to answer. What is China's modernized socialist state? What are they trying to achieve in the very long run? Can you imagine that it would eventually happen?
中国式现代化 Chinese modernization. I think what it's about is, since I graduated from university in the 1990s, around 2000, this was sort of globalization began, and the unipolar moment began after the Cold War. We all thought that if everybody just copied America, we will succeed. Okay. All the developing countries. So what happened, if we look back, if you look at BRICS, for instance, somebody coined the term BRICS, I think in the late 1990s or something, I forget. China is the only one that excelled. All the others have stagnated. If you look at wider developing world, Southeast Asia, Africa, I mean, some of these countries, many of these countries, they literally had Americans write their constitution. Probably graduated from the Kennedy School. But, I mean, literally none succeeded. So why? Why? We didn't copy the Constitution. That's why. So modernization. So what people had assumed was that somehow, in order to modernize, you have to adopt a set of ideologies or values. I call it modernity. So let me say that maybe Chinese modernization is an attempt to explain to ourselves and to demonstrate to other countries in the world that modernity is not a prerequisite for modernization. You can modernize without having to buy the prospectus of modernity. And what's modernity? Modernity is ideology. So, namely, the philosophy that the individual is the most basic unit of society, it's God-given rights. You have to have liberal politics, divided government, liberal rule of law, elections, multiple parties, all that stuff, okay, that they gave to Iraq after the war. Okay. So you have to do these political stuff first. You have to adopt these ideologies and these values first in order to achieve modernization. And modernization is essentially material. Okay. And if we analyze the last 30 years of all the developing countries, Russia copied Western constitution. Okay. The only country that really truly succeeded in a big way refused modernity. We shot the kids in the late 1980s, as Giorgio said, tragically, in a way. But we refused. Yet we succeeded. Why? So I think what we need, what we're trying to explain to ourselves is what we did right and what we can continue to do right. And an attempt to show to the global south that you don't have to buy their ideologies. Maybe you're not succeeding precisely because you bought their ideologies. To adopt these values and philosophies in order, that's the only way to modernization. That's not even true for them. I was having this talk in Malaysia with a great professor from Oxford who said that you can't change your history. I mean, England was under perfect circumstances at the time. The individual, the Protestant religion, all the values, all that propelled them to industrialization and all that success. Many of the countries here don't have that, but you can still do it. That was his point. And I said, what made it really perfect for England that we can't do? We can't go out and get ourselves a bunch of colonies. You can have Magna Carta up to here. Without the colonies, you think the British Empire will succeed in modernization? I don't think so. But we did it without colonies. So that's something that we should think about and explain to ourselves and show to the world. That's what Chinese modernization means to me.
Tony, any response?
One thing I agree with is that there's multiple paths to modernization. I mean, Japanese political structure and orders is democratic, but it's very different from America. My country, we have kings and queens, which is hardly a very democratic institution. So I'm confident, yes, that China will find its own path, and it should find its own path. The one thing where I disagree with you is I don't think China has succeeded yet. It may be on the path to success, but I don't think it's actually there yet. That's where I would differ with you on that. One other comment where you talked about centralized leadership. I think when Xi Jinping took power, China was a mess. And at that point, I can see completely the logic why things had to be centralized. Because things were slipping out of control. And that would have been no good for anybody, America neither. The question is it really helping China now? Or has it gone too far? My answer to that, of course, is I think it's gone too far. And I think it's very difficult to step back from that. We've seen in previous iterations, 新传位主义, 新保守主义, and it's always been premised on the fact that give us the power, we'll centralize, and then we'll give it back. And that's very rarely worked. So I do think there's a real challenge in the political arena for China now, how it deals with that question. So that would be my immediate response to that.
Great. I have a lot more questions to ask, and I have sent you all the questions yesterday, and you can answer them over email. But given the title of the discussion, which is the ego and the dragon, or the dragon of ego, depending on which side you're standing, I want to ask one question for each of you to respond very quickly, 30 seconds. President Xi from China spent 4 hours in a room with President Biden. Seems that, at least in front of the camera, they had better relationship than 2 months ago. President Xi gave a talk at dinner organized by the US-China Business Council, very well received with distinguished people like Elon Musk and Tim Cook attending. Later on, some people, not all, criticized President Biden for giving the stage to President Xi because he became all of a sudden popular among the US business leaders. So are we expecting improved US-China relation? Well, I guess until November 2024. Or this is just sort of the improved weather for now and the climate will continue to deteriorate? A very broad general question, but please give us some very sharp and short answer.
The fact that they're talking is important because basically legitimizes conversations at different levels on more specific aspects where the relationship needs to move forward. I mean, I think it's clear Biden still thinks Xi is a dictator. Xi still thinks the biggest block and constraint to China's development is the United States. And I think most importantly, neither country's been able to articulate a framework that the other can buy into that will give the relationship stability. So to me, in that sense, to answer your question, it means that the relationship is still very vulnerable to other events. And, I think we'll have some stability this year. Much will depend what happens after the elections. Very quickly, there are very clear reasons why, from the US perspective, it benefits from collaboration with China. I mean, it's a huge business interest, apart from anything else. Secondly, most countries in the region want a stable relationship, so they can plan out their strategies of how they engage with that. And also, there's a set of categories of global problems which are important to all countries, which really need the US and China to cooperate. Global commons, we've talked about climate, global engagement, dealing with future pandemics, peacekeeping, and global regulation, cybersecurity, trade, those areas. So there are very strong pressing reasons why, but I still think there's no fundamental basis that gives long-term security for the relationship.
Well, apparently it was a successful meeting. I think a good sign is they talked for 4 hours, which is a long time, and the readout was very brief. And that's a good sign because it shows that they shared a lot in private. And when as much private exchanges take place between top leaders, the better off we are. So it's not for public consumption, and that's a good sign. It seems that they're trying to provide a floor to the relationship. Now, but I would say that I think the structural competition is the secular trend. It's very difficult to avoid, and that's we're going to have difficult times ahead because it's so structural. And then next year obviously is an unpredictable year for the U.S.
I guess I already said I think a lot depends on what happens next year, and I think it is unpredictable. Yeah, no, I mean, I think the talk, was a good sign. I'm starting to see it. I don't know that it's, it was a major development in U.S.-China relations. As I said before, I think there are kind of issues that the United States has that have created this kind of backlash against globalization that are still there, and none of them are they're very real. The national security concerns, and also this kind of view that globalization has caused this economic scarring, that's hurt people, that's hurt communities in the United States, and I think until we kind of address those problems, I don't think we're going to see a lot of improvement in the relationship.
Edward?
I would basically, so just two quick things. One is I would pretty much echo what the others have said. So I view it, I think is formally, in terms of formal relationship, probably it is a floor, mostly because of timing, right, and our own election, for example, coming up. So probably, what the optimistic part of me says, probably a floor. I think I'm sort of been less concerned about the formal relationship in that sense, because I sort of expected it to get worse and then muddle. But I'm actually what I was very heartened by was not just the military to military, very important that Tony mentioned, but also the fact that I was much more worried, particularly during the Trump administration, of the other issues. Meaning, fundamentally, I think the biggest risk, right, and many people argue this, is around accidents, right? And the accident issue, the risk of that was very high during the Trump administration because there was such a pullback and an undermining of other assets, meaning diplomatic assets, military leadership assets in this region. On the U.S. side, that Biden has brought back to normal, revert to the mean. And that I think is much more important actually in terms of the ecosystem than necessarily the formal meetings. In my opinion, the only last thing I want to say is, so one thing, Highway, that I would probably disagree with you on is when you speak to a lot of our Chinese friends and colleagues and counterparts, I often hear about multipolarity. Now, there's an MIT, you're part of it. There's an MIT mafia here, so is Victor. There's MIT mafia here who did their PhDs at MIT. And I had to do like political economy and international relations. It was tough because you do both. And, in terms of international relations theory, multipolarity is very clear, right? You need 3 or more great powers. So in my mind, I think there's a real normative kind of argument that I hear a lot from Chinese, not all, but many of different political stripes, really sort of pushing this idea that we're in a multipolar world. I don't see that at all. Right? So who is the third great power? Is it India because it has slightly larger military than the U.S. on a per people? A quarter of the U.S. budget, military budget? No. Is it Japan? So in economics, is it Japan? That's number 3. That's a quarter of China's GDP. So I viscerally push back against this concept of multipolarity. I mean, we are in a bipolar world with significant asymmetries between the two great powers, and I always wonder, why are we going towards multipolarity? There's it's a bigger separate conference and discussion, but I just want to kind of push back.
Ryan is going to talk about ASEAN. Your time, 2 minutes most.
Militarily, I think we're in a unipolar world, by the way. I think the US remains dominant. Economically and commercially, we're in a bipolar world with some regional clusters forming and emerging. And thirdly, symbolically or discursively, I suppose that's where multipolarity really kicks in, where we see the EU and ASEAN, projecting significant power through regulatory and also soft power and standard setting. The EU in terms of AI regulation, but also more generally speaking, compliance and considerations pertaining to what makes a good society, and ASEAN when it comes to demonstrating what an alternative path of triangulation looks like amid an era of economic bipolarity, where you can have Thailand pursuing bamboo diplomacy, Bapak Jokowi, for instance, in Indonesia, saying that he's going to be open to collaborate with both the US and China. The US, especially over South China, sees China economically and commercially as a no-brainer. And thirdly, of course, you've got a slew of other countries that are really engaging proactively, not just all parties and great powers, but also internally amongst themselves. I mean, one of the greatest and key investors into southern Vietnam, is Thai investors and Thai businesses who move right across, the Indochina peninsula in accessing and tapping into the fellow ASEAN partners. So that's my thought on the polarity conversation there. And very quickly, 2 quick thoughts. Firstly, it's great that leaders like she talked about issues like AI, like resuming people exchanges by having, say, 50,000 American students welcome to China. I would say let's wait and see if China could indeed, or if the American scholars would indeed reciprocate. But also, it's a positive sign that track to and people-to-people exchanges and diplomacy is valued at the highest levels. And of course, the pandas are always helpful. And the second comment is, let's not underestimate the asinine banality or the banal asinine nature of the American Congress. And that's where I think the unpredictability comes in. I'm less concerned about Biden himself. I think he's ultimately a very pragmatic politician. I'm also not that concerned about his advisors. Yes, many are hawkish on China, but at the end of the day, with Kurt Campbell, you know what you're getting. What I'm more concerned about and less certain about is a slew of Republicans in Congress who seem to have staked their careers out of demonizing China. And I'm going to name, Gallagher here. No Gallagher fans or apologists, I'm sorry. But Mike Gallagher has single-handedly contributed towards more anti-Chinese racism than, all the other racists that we've seen as pundits and also key opinion influencers combined in America. So never underestimate the banality of evil, or how banal evil people are, which are 2 different things, really. And just very quickly, I don't see a structural change, but it's good that they talked. Again, the devil lies in the details. So what exactly went on in that 4 hours of closed-door conversations that wasn't included in the readout? That's the million-dollar question, and I haven't really heard convincing answers just yet. So thank you very much.
Let me conclude very quickly by first saying thank you so much to all of you, but especially to the Harvard professors who came all the way from Boston to Asia. They just flew in literally from Singapore around noontime. After a very, very quick bite, came here to give us so much insight and ideas about what's going on in the world, in particular in China, in the United States, and about the bilateral relationship, which remains to be the most important one. The title has the second part, which is really about what the rest of the world can do. I guess Brian and Edward, to some extent, have touched on those issues. I guess we still live in a very uncertain world, but I'm so happy to see American professors coming back to Asia again to engage in people-to-people exchanges, intellectual exchanges, and these are very important for us, as Dean Emmenher has said very earlier. When the government find a lot of challenges to discuss common, shared, important issues, it is our role as academics, as think tank experts, to share knowledge and to inspire each other, and hopefully through these activities we can enhance mutual understanding and prevent any unnecessary conflicts. So let me stop here and thank you so much for coming.
大家好，本期视频分享的是2023年李世默参加的一档对话节目。节目当中李世默深入地分析了中国的经济，极其的经典，就连博主这样不懂经济的人也依然能够感觉自己能够听得懂。过去中国经济依靠三驾马车：房地产、互联网平台经济以及中低端产业。大量的资本进入这些行业，也导致行业越来越不健康，而且中国只赚取了极少部分的利润，远低于美国同时期的30%多的利润，这样远远不够。中国这么多人，如何才能够像美国一样过上更好的日子呢？那就必须进行产业升级，供给侧改革，引导资本进入这些高科技、技术含量高的产业，彻底进行产业升级。我们不要只从事那些低端、低附加值、低技术、低效率的产业，我们的产业要向上发展，向上升级。芯片、半导体、AI、芯片、半导体、AI、新能源汽车等等高科技产业，我们绝对不能缺席。因为这一步关乎我们中华民族的命运，关乎中华民族的未来，必须要去争夺。说到这儿，可能很多网友就想到了，你这么干不就是抢了美国的饭碗吗？你说的对了，大家都知道什么高科技的东西只要中国的产业突破了，价格必定会降到原价格的1/10。以中国的不要命的工作精神，欧美的这些国家怎么可能竞争得过中国？欧美国家想依靠高科技产业过好日子的梦想那不得破碎了吗？还怎么让发展中国家给他们生产袜子、生产衣服，给他们生产羽毛球，对吧？所以这也是中美竞争的最关键的核心原因之一。美国为什么要打贸易战、芯片战、科技战？不就是因为以上的原因吗？这也是中国的可怕之处。他们害怕中国人砸了他们的饭碗，所以美国推动制造业回流、贸易保护。但烽火可以告诉你的是，以上动作只是徒劳而已，因为市场规律它就在那里，没人可以改变。中国人能吃苦、勤奋，能生产比你们便宜10倍的东西，所以无论是芯片还是半导体产业还是 AI， 中国一定会胜利，也必然会胜利。好了，本期视频就说到这儿，不知道大家是否同意烽火的观点？不同意呢，请打在评论区，我们评论区见。